Thank you all very much for coming this morning. Our topic today is, as you can well imagine, a very important one for our parishes. We want to be welcoming to everyone, and children and adults on the autism spectrum have special needs, and in order to be welcoming to them, it can sometimes be a challenge. And a lot of people don't understand what autism is all about. So we're very privileged to have Darcy Fargo with us today. She's the editor of the North Country Catholic, but she's also the mom of Jake, who is on the spectrum. So without any further introduction, it's all yours, Darcy.
Use the stand because I have a bad habit of talking with my hands, and that frees them up to do that. So a couple things before I get started. I just wanted to first thank you all for inviting me to speak to you today. This is something I'm very passionate about. Obviously, having a son who is on the spectrum, this is something that's near and dear to my heart, and it's also something that I've seen that we don't always do awesome as a church and as a community in general, is to be welcoming to those who are differently abled or who have a disability of some type. Second, I want to note that when I'm kind of an excitable person, if you know me, and when I am excited and when there's something I'm passionate about, I do tend to be a little bit of a fast talker. So if I start doing that and I get where I'm talking very quickly, please just feel free to give me a gesture to settle me down and slow me down. So why are we having this conversation? So we had an experience in our parish at St. Mary's in Brushton where a family stopped coming to church because they didn't feel welcome. They had a son who's slightly younger than mine. My son is 12. They have a child who's slightly younger than my son, and he has some interesting autism-related behaviors, which we're going to discuss a little bit. And the family felt that people were judging them, and they were hearing comments, and they were hearing whispers, and they were getting some stares about his odd behaviors. And so they stopped coming to church. Now, as we reached out to this family to try to come up with a solution to make this situation better, I reached out to a handful of friends of mine who are speech-language pathologists, occupational therapists, people involved in ministry who know someone who's on the autism spectrum or who have some other interest in this topic. I looked back through my records recently. I reached out to 13 people in total. Every single one of them, to the person, told me a story about someone they knew who stopped attending worship, not always Catholic, but in most cases it was, because someone on the spectrum was not being welcomed, or felt like they were a burden on the community, or felt like they were in some way being judged. So ultimately we can do better. So let's just talk about, first of all, again, why it's important. Current figures from the Center for Disease Control have autism rates at 1 in 59. It's 4 times more prevalent in boys than in girls. But statistically speaking, at that rate, at 1 in 60, you all know someone who's on the autism spectrum, or there is someone in your parish community who is on the autism spectrum. There's a saying in the autism community, however. If you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism. Autism is a spectrum disorder. It covers a wide variety of symptoms, and it covers a wide variety of severities. There are people at the classical autism end of the spectrum, which we might think of the person who would be in a more special education setting. They might be completely nonverbal right up through adulthood, and they might exhibit some of these autism-related behaviors we're going to discuss profoundly, and they have profound impacts on their lives. At the vast other end of the spectrum is people who have what they used to refer to as Asperger's syndrome. They've since changed the diagnostic standards, and now it's all just referred to as autism spectrum disorder, and it's just what level of severity you're assigned. And so these individuals who used to be classified as having Asperger's would typically be very verbal, they would typically be high functioning, but they still would have some of these quirks and some of these issues that are autism related that we're going to discuss as we go. My son, if you're wondering, he's actually smack dab in the middle. When he was diagnosed, his diagnosis was pervasive developmental delay, not otherwise specified, PDD-NOS. And again, it's smack dab in the center of the autism spectrum. So when he was diagnosed, which was a month after his second birthday, he was completely nonverbal. Everything was "ba." A cup was "ba," A ball was ba, my husband and I were ba, everything was ba. He had completely no functional speech whatsoever. If you've ever been around kids, even toddlers and babies, you'll know that before they can talk, they will typically point to things to express intent. So if little Jake wants a cookie, little Jake is going to point to that cookie to tell you they want a cookie. My son did not have that. He did not even have that level of communication. He had to be taught to point to express intent. So as we go over some of these autism-related issues, it's important to know that different individuals on the spectrum will manifest them differently. They might have a little column A, a little column B, a little column C, they might have all of the above, and there might be some even here that I didn't go into. In fact, I know there are some symptoms that I didn't go into here. I'm just kind of hitting the most common ones. So if I leave out something that is an issue that for someone you love with autism or someone you know who has sensory processing disorder, I apologize. So I would break the most common manifestations of autism into 3 categories: relationship skills, sensory processing, and stimming and behavioral issues. Yes?
Do you have any handouts, or do we have to take those real fast?
I don't have any handouts, but I can, that's,
Can you just repeat those 3?
and actually I'm going to go over them all as subcategories as well. Relationship skills, sensory processing, and stimming or behavioral issues. And again, I'll explain all of these a little bit more as we go. So we'll start with relationship skills. People with autism often have communications issues. Like I said, Jake was completely nonverbal up until he was almost 3, in fact, before he got really functional speech. Some who are verbal may have difficulty understanding nuances of language. They might not pick up on things like sarcasm, or they might not pick up on words that have multiple meanings. They fixate, if they get a definition of a word, that's going to be their static definition of that word forever. And so it's very hard for them to discover subtleties in language. They'll often use, especially early on, when they're developing speech skills, if that's something that's going to happen, in some cases for their entire lives, they'll exhibit what they call echolalia, which is repeating phrases that they hear. When Jake was young, we heard far more lines from SpongeBob SquarePants than we cared to admit. And I also heard far more of my typical lines than I care to admit, because I don't like them very much when they're being used against me. In some cases, their speech may be monotone. An individual on the spectrum might have very little emotion in their voice. They might not respond to being called. When Jake was really little, we thought he might be deaf, because you could literally yell his name and it was like he was off in another planet. He was completely spaced out, looking in another direction, and he was completely oblivious to the fact that we were even acknowledging him. They often prefer independent play or activities. Jake is an only child, so to some extent it's a good thing that he can play very independently, but in a social setting, in a school setting, obviously that can be a little bit isolating. But Jake is very much happy as a clam, playing with his action figures and creating role play for himself. His best play is by himself as far as he's concerned. They're very literal. I love to tell the story of when Jake was in his special education preschool. He started his special education preschool at just about 2.5 years of age. So if you can imagine putting a 2.5-year-old on a bus to go send them for a full day of school, that's a little bit heartbreaking, and that had its challenges with it. And it's also, I'm not very organized in the morning. I am not a morning person. And so that was my first foray into getting a child ready for school in the morning. There was one day we were waiting for the bus to arrive, and it had snowed pretty heavily, and I thought I would be a good mom and shovel off the steps so Jake could have a clean exit to the bus. I get the shovel, step out in the step, Jake is behind me on the porch. I start shoveling, I hear click. He locked the porch door. As I'm sure you can all imagine, the next thing that happened is that the bus pulled up. So here I am, locked off the porch, and Jake is on the porch, thinking this is quite hysterical. I did not think this was very hysterical. So I'm getting a little heated and probably not using my best judgment, and I'm saying, Jake, open the door. And he's pushing on the door and it's not open, and I'm saying, Jake, open the door, come on, open the door. And he's pushing on the door and it's not opening, and he's thinking it's funny stuff. I had to stop, compose myself, and say to him, unlock the door. So he had to physically know to take that first step, and then he could open the door. They also have a difficulty interpreting facial cues or body language. You have to expressly tell Jake what you mean. one of the most common things you'll hear in our family, if you've ever read my column or if you've ever spoken to me, we joke around a lot in my family. And so one of the most common things that Jake is saying is, are you being serious or are you kidding? Because he can't always tell based on our facial expressions and based on our body language that we're kidding at any given point. They may have difficulty understanding societal norms and typical behavior. A friend of mine was just telling me the story, and this is sad and I'm sorry I'm laughing a little bit, but her son, who is an adult, who is on the autism spectrum, has his own apartment. And just this week there was an incident where the elderly lady next door passed away. And so he was standing outside as the fire department and the rescue department arrived and were processing the situation and handling the death. And just then Meals on Wheels pulls up to deliver this woman's meal. And so my friend's son turns to them and says, I don't think she's going to be eating that. Because he didn't get that that was not the proper response in that situation.
But he understood it to be matter of fact.
Yeah, exactly. To him it was just, no, she's not going to be eating that meal. So the next category of manifestations is sensory processing. And these can also, while they're very common with individuals with autism spectrum disorder, they can also be present in people who are not on the spectrum but who have sensory processing disorder. And these are also probably the biggest reasons why worship is hard for people who are on the spectrum. So these are probably the critical things. People who are on the spectrum can be either hyposensitive or hypersensitive in just about any of their senses. So a very, very common one is extreme sensitivity to noise. My son had this when he was very young. We would try to, he loves movies, absolutely loves Disney cartoons, Marvel superheroes. He's absolutely obsessed with those kinds of things. And he's also, much to my dismay, obsessed with professional wrestling. He loves WWE like it is nobody's business. He was bound and determined that he wanted to go see a show. And we had to say, if you've ever watched professional wrestling, the shows are insane. People are yelling things, there's loud music, there's pyrotechnics. I mean, it's just a very loud spectacle. And so we had to say to him, dude, you can't even go to an indoor movie without crying and having to leave. Like, how are you going to do a show? So he was bound and determined to overcome those sensory issues. So he started by attending sensory-friendly movie showings in Plattsburgh, where they reduce the house light, they reduce the volume level, and they're okay with kids getting up and moving around if necessary. And he got where he mastered those. And then he went on to a typical movie theater using noise-reducing headphones, like the kind you'd use while you're mowing your lawn or going to the shooting range or working on heavy equipment. And so then he got to the point where he could do the movies without the noise-reducing headphones. So finally he got to the point where he could go see his beloved WWE at a live show. And so he's actually since now done 5 or 6 live shows. The first one he did, he brought his noise-reducing headphones and he only put them on once. And since then, now he'll participate in the chanting and he will add to the crazy. Now, for the people who do have the extreme sensitivity to sound, noises are amplified significantly to them. So even a normal level conversation can be painful to their hearing. And so in a building like a church, what happens, especially some of our larger buildings where they echo a lot, it creates a lot of noise that you and I aren't hearing. And it, you think of the cacophony of it all, like all of us singing, some of us better than others, all the bells ringing, all the kneelers dropping, all the noise that's going on simultaneously, the people who are chatting who probably shouldn't be, all the other things that are going on. It's just noise overload for people who have those sensory issues. Some people who are on the autism spectrum are highly sensitive to smells as well. So again, if those smells are coming, you ever go through the perfume section in a mall and just find it almost nauseating? A normal level smell has that effect on someone who has that sensitivity to smell. So again, you think of a church setting where the person 2 rows in front of you is wearing cologne and then the person behind you has a lotion on and everybody has all these different smells going on. And that's my next one. This is probably our biggest remaining issue with Jake actually, is food. Extreme sensitivity to taste and textures with oral stuff. They refer to it commonly as the autism beige diet. They tend to gravitate towards foods that are bland and foods that are pretty soft and neutral in consistency, things like pastas and breads. I refer to Jake as a carbo-fruitarian because he likes carbs and he likes fruits. But that's we've really fought to try to introduce meats and vegetables, but anything with any kind of strong flavor is going to be a no. Anything with an interesting texture, you think celeries or pineapples or things that are stringy, or even meats where they're, a steak where you might have to chew it more and it might have more fibrous tissue, those are absolutely no-goes with Jake. And he will literally vomit if he has one of those things. Before we got meat into his diet a little bit more, he once caught me sneaking a slice of shaved ham. I mean, it was so thin you couldn't even see it. And I tried to hide it into his grilled cheese sandwich, and he did not eat grilled cheese sandwich for 4 months. Some individuals with autism also experience sensitivities to touch. Now, this one is a weird one because it seems like there's two extremes that are common. Either there's extreme hypersensitivity or extreme hyposensitivity. So I know some kids on the spectrum who any sort of tag in their clothing or even any sort of seam in their clothing can cause a complete and utter meltdown and complete and utter discomfort. And then there are other kids on the spectrum who crave compression and who want squeezing or weighted blankets and compression. My son has this device that they call a Yogi Bo, and it's basically like a glorified oversized beanbag. And he will lay on the Yogi Bo, and we'll wrap it around him, and then I will lay on top of it, and we call it the Jacob Taco. And as you can tell, I am not a little person. And so there is a lot of compression going on to that kid, and he absolutely thrives on that. But I know other people who have children on the spectrum where if you so much as touch them, which was, horrible when their children were babies and they'd be screaming, and your natural instinct to console them is to go hug them and touch them, and that was a painful experience for them, and that exacerbated their issues. And so there's both extremes on that spectrum. Light as well. And so you think of, they say it's magnified up to several shades brighter for them. So the light is always inundating a little bit more. And then again, you think of a church experience where there's stained glass and where there's usually less than awesome fluorescent lighting that's way up in the air. And then there's all sorts of reflections going on and candles. And so it's light overload in some cases. So again, all those sensory processing, it becomes sensory overload for these individuals. And so that is why you will see the next thing is these autism-related behaviors. There's a term in the autism community called self-stimulating behavior. Stimming is what most people refer to it as. Those are those repetitive motions that people think of when they think of the stereotypically autistic person. It might be rocking, it might be hopping or jumping, it might be a flapping thing. Jake was a flapper. Jake still is to some extent a flapper, and so I'll tell you what I mean by the flapping. When Jake was quite young, the flapping, he literally looked like he was going to take flight with a fist. It was this. And now he's down to something more like this, like it's a hand motion that he'll do. He also used to be a hopper, and he would just hop repetitively. You'd think it was going to fall through the floor in some cases. It was just a stomping. And now that's kind of replaced with a little skip step thing he does. It's kind of a rigid leg skip step that he does when he gets excited. The best theory is that these actions are undertaken because if they're creating some sort of stimuli, it helps them block out all these things that they can't control that are bombarding them with. And that's how Jake describes it, is that it gives him an opportunity to block out all the rest, is when he's stimming. That can be what in some people it's utterances. They can really run the gamut. It can almost be like a Tourette's-like utterance in some cases, or a shrieking. It can be jumping, hopping, flapping, skipping, rocking. People can smash their heads into walls. In some cases, they'll express self-harm because again, they're trying so hard to create some sort of input to block out this world that they can't control, that's overwhelming them. They also may take some actions to reduce those stimuli. Again, they might wear noise-reducing headphones like the ones that Jake wore so he could go see his beloved wrestling. They might wear sunglasses in situations where it does not seem appropriate. They might, the young man in our parish that was having the issues, he's very photosensitive and has light issues, and so he would try to climb under the pews in some cases to try to evade the light. They also might use sensory tools. Like I said, Jake has his Yogi Bo that he uses for his Jacob Taco. They might also have a compression vest or a compression stocking. They might have quiet fidget toys or something that they can manipulate to try to distract themselves. They might use any other number of things that we're going to discuss a little bit more, actually. So how do we help? If you have a family in your parish that has an individual with autism, and I can almost guarantee you that you do, how do you be welcoming to that individual? So first, it's important to know that any of these individuals who are on the autism spectrum can look completely and utterly normal. So that's important for the level of acceptance. So that kid that you see that might be behaving oddly, or that adult that you see might be behaving oddly, who looks completely normal, may have something like an autism spectrum disorder or some other issue that they have going on. So that child who's doing like those weird things might be actually just someone who's struggling to get through a difficult behavior. Generally, these are aware that they're different. They're aware that in many cases they're ostracized. Be conscious of how you're behaving around them. That's a very simple one. Start by being kind. So if you see a family that is struggling, now, actually, I mentioned when I started that we failed this family in our parish. And I said that I specifically failed this family in this parish. What do I mean by that? I recognized that this was happening, and I didn't do a darn thing about it. Why didn't I do a darn thing about it? Because you get this idea that mom is going to be upset if someone suggests that she doesn't have it all together. Or at least that's what I was thinking. But family, and you want to offer to help, and I was thinking about this after the fact, of course hindsight is always 20/20. Approach them. Tell them that you love seeing their family in church. Offer to sit near them. Open up to sit with my family, sit in the pew with us, sit in the pew in front of us. That way if you need to tend to your other children, I can help. Or if you need someone to run a child to the bathroom, I can help. Or regardless, I can just stand behind you and smile and not be bothered when they're playing and doing whatever it is that they're doing. Acknowledge the individual with autism. Again, these people are constantly overlooked. Like when you see an individual doing something weird like flapping in the back of the church, you might be tempted to walk on by and not acknowledge that because you don't know what to say. But even as something as simple as, thanks for joining us today, or I'm really glad to see you here, can go a long way to making somebody feel welcome and acknowledged. They want friends too, and they want to be included too. So if the person has the ability to strike up a conversation, put in the work. Know that it's going to be a little awkward, and you're probably going to have to ask more of the questions that might not be reciprocated, but put in some of the work. Actually started offering sensory tools in the back of the church building. And we were able to put together a sensory tool basket for roughly $45. So we included noise-reducing headphones, we included sunglasses, we included a balance disc. It's a little cushion that's inflated that you can sit on, and you have to balance and have to work at balancing to give them something to do, to occupy their brains. It has this cute little bug-shaped like massage tool that vibrates, so he can give himself that input. A series of quiet fidget toys. We also sewed about a 4-inch wide, probably 3-foot long snake, we call it, and filled it with 2 to 3 pounds of rice, so he can use it as a compression stocking. So next to nothing in it for cost. And the noise-reducing headphones I had in my house because Jake had about 4 pairs, but how many of us have them in our house for mowing the lawn or for going shooting or for doing work with heavy tools? So a lot of these things we were able to get without anyone having to buy. But if you do want some ideas for resources, feel free to reach out to me and I can send you links to some of the things that we were employing. One of the things that I just thought of that we haven't yet done at our parish, but I'm going to be leaning on to get done, put up a sign in your parish. Designate someone as a contact person who's willing to help. To say, hey, if you have someone in your family or in your group who has a disability and needs accommodations, please reach out to us. We want to be welcoming to everybody. And like I said, for a very little bit of money and a very little bit of effort, we were able to really turn things around for this family in our parish that was struggling. And more than anything, they said it was just nice to know that people put in the work and wanted them to be there. So we did. Also consider doing some educational stuff like this. Marika and I don't know if you know Marika Donders in the back from the director about evangelization for the diocese. We were discussing this, and one of the things we're going to do going forward is to put together some snippets about autism to go into the bulletins. Just break it down into some small paragraphs so we have those educational. Because I don't think people are being mean because they want to be mean. They're being mean because they just don't legitimately know. And so if we can help with that, then it's going to help all of these families feel more included and more welcome. And wrapping it up, if you take anything from this presentation at all, just please be aware of how you respond to others. You know, I know it's easy for us when the kid's being obnoxious or when someone's doing something goofy to laugh or to point or to say something, but it's hurtful when we do that, and regardless of the situation, whether it's a person who has a disability, whether it's a person who's dealing with some trauma that you're just not aware of, or whether it legitimately is just a bad kid. It doesn't matter. They should all be welcome to worship. Any questions?
I have two.
Go ahead.
And I have three, actually. So I'm the director of the Religious Ed in St. Peter, so very often we get the kids that will show up either in second grade, third grade, you know, parents could feel when they were younger, and now they want to get them to have their sacraments or whatever. And again, depending on the level of the child, we've had kids successfully integrate in with, you know, the general public school kids. But then we also have the opposite side where they're just really totally unnatural, and the parent themselves, unfortunately, has issues and are not able to give us the proper resources to be able to help the child. So
I don't have as much experience, obviously, with that. I would actually suggest that you reach out to the group in Watertown that does the special education, religious education. But in that case, you almost,
because they're taught about it separately as a group,
and that's,
and we don't have the resources to be able to do that right now.
and in some cases, I know in our parish, we've had to have people at a lower level of, you know, so the person who is in second or third grade might actually be with the kindergarten class, because obviously otherwise there's no benefit to it whatsoever. But, I mean, other than having an aide or someone to be an additional resources.
Like, oh no, we don't need an aide. Like, yeah, I do.
And 'cause, like, my son, again, he's relatively high functioning, and he has an aide to function in a typical classroom setting because he gets distracted very easily and he needs someone to divert him back. And because sometimes what that person also will do is when a teacher will ask the general class and everybody, question to the class and everybody raises their hand, she makes Jake answer every single one of those questions to keep him engaged and to keep him on top of the material. And so that's been a really effective strategy for him, but again, it needs the resources to do it.
How are they, again, for the ones that really need this, you know, refocusing piece, my recommendation always is to those families is that, you know, we teach them separately or have them do it, you know, I try to do it more often than not, those don't want to do that. And it's hurtful to me, or it's, you know, I feel bad because I feel like we're failing now.
And it's a tough situation all around because obviously the individuals who are on the autism spectrum also deserve to be included in some context. You know, we had one individual in another community that I've been involved in the past where it was a 1.5 hour church school session. So he would show up 45 minutes in, do the fun activity with them, and then stayed after and got individual instruction for the actual instruction part. But again, it takes the willingness to have the resources. Any other questions?
Do we know what causes autism?
There's as many opinions on that as there are people, and so I'm at the point in my life, at least, where I really don't care, and so here it is. If you ask me, I would say there's probably a strong genetic component to it, but beyond that, I think there's probably a lot of factors, and I know there are some genetic tests that will confirm certain types of autism, but then there are other types that don't seem to have a common marker, and you know, how much of it is environment and how much of it is whatever. Again, I'm at the point now where I'm just like, I don't care, it is my reality, and so that's just what I deal with on the day-to-day. Yes?
Well, I've covered in your parish. Jake has served mass several times, and I had no idea, so must be doing something right.
You'll sometimes see some stimming on the altar if you're watching for it, but our parish community has been very welcoming of Jake, which is why it's kind of interesting that this other family had this other experience, but Jake's issues and his stims probably aren't as obtrusive as this other little guy's. Like he's never climbed under a pew, he wouldn't fit under a pew, Jake's a big kid, you know, so we've never had some of those issues that have impeded on anyone else, and so maybe that's why he's always been so warmly accepted, but no, we can't say enough about how great Jake has been accepted in our parish, and I'm actually just going to give an added plug. Jake is at Guggenheim right now, and they went out of their way to accommodate him. So they had a staff member assigned to him for the first couple of days of camp to help him with the transition. They customized a Jacob diet so he could participate, and they allowed me to kind of abuse my diocesan position to go out there yesterday and be Smother of the Year and take my camera and spy on my child. So he's doing wonderfully and having a great time. Any other questions?
So, part of the reason why I came today, aside from the religious ed piece, is that I have a very good friend who adopted a foster baby who was born drug addicted, and he's now 4, and he exhibits every single thing that you just described. I mean, suits nuts. And they attributed all his behavior issues and all these things to the drug situation. You know, he's had seizures, they've done all kinds of, brain things, and they basically have no idea how to manage this child and how to treat him because they just don't know. His brain is just such.
How old is the child?
He's now 4.
So I think at that
And
age,
he also has, like, his hippocampus is, like, destroyed. So he exhibits every single one of these behaviors, and they attributed to his, seizure disorder and the, drug thing that he experienced in vitro. But I'm now wondering if he also.
and they're often comorbidities. There's a series of things that often have symptoms that are similar to autism or that have autism as one of the things that goes along with it. And seizure disorders would be a common one. For us, in each county is a little bit different. In Franklin County, at least, which is where I live, up into age 5, they're under the ward of public health.
Right.
And so any referrals and any evaluations would be done through public health. And for Jacob, he was evaluated, so this is one of the lovely things about living in New York is when we were going through public health and when he was going through the early intervention program and they first said the phrase, have you thought about having him evaluated for autism when he was just doing speech therapy? And of course, I knew nothing about autism. I'm not going to lie. Prior to the diagnosis, the months leading up to the diagnosis, I knew absolutely nothing about autism. And so when we started from having to research all of that, and they were going to send us to a developmental pediatrician through public health. The wait time at that point was 18 months, was from the time you were referred to the time you actually would see a physician. So we were lucky that my husband works for a school district, so we have really good health insurance, and we had the resources to travel all over the state. So we called developmental pediatricians all over the state until we were able to get him in 2 months instead of 18. But it is absolutely obscene the wait times right now to get evaluated to begin with. Jake was able to get speech therapy prior to his diagnosis. The second he got the diagnosis, he had speech therapy 3 times a week, from 1 times a week, ABA therapy, applied behavioral analysis therapy 3 times a week, special education services twice a week. I mean, all in the matter of 1 swipe of a pen, it increased to that level, and all in our home until he went to the special education preschool, where he still got speech therapy, ABA therapy, occupational therapy. He still got most of those up until last year. We backed off occupational therapy. He didn't need that anymore.
Thank you for that tip. Thank you.
What about the memory level?
My son has memory like a steel trap. It is the scariest thing you will ever see in your life. So he loves his professional wrestling, and if he could apply the memory to his schoolwork like he does to professional wrestling and NFL football, we would be all set. So there was one year we went to Mickey's Not So Scary Halloween party at Disney World, and again, Jake's love of wrestling, he went as Hulk Hogan and I dressed up as Macho Man Randy Savage. And we were telling one of my colleagues at Alcoa about these costumes, and he says to my son, serious as a heart attack, well, Hulk Hogan was the first person to body slam Andre the Giant. And Jake, without missing a trick, is like, yeah, that was WrestleMania 3. All these weird little details. We've been to Florida probably 5 times now, and I can say, well, what year was it we went on the helicopter ride? And he can tell you which year who went with us, which place we stayed in. I mean, it is the creepiest thing I've ever seen, and sometimes it's really handy, and sometimes you wish you could shut it off. So. Yes. Is there a way of helping a parent that's in denial? We run into this far more than you'd like. I get asked this question far more than I wish I could, because nobody wants to have their child have a diagnosis. There is an extreme grieving process that goes with that. We went to the developmental pediatrician fully expecting a diagnosis. In fact, we knew exactly which level on the spectrum where he would be. and we still cried the whole way home. And so it is a tough process to admit that your kid is different and might not ever have those capabilities. And so very frequently people will decline to have their child evaluated, or I know some others who have been diagnosed, received some services, were doing well, and allowed the school to declassify their child. And it's because they don't want their child to have a disability. So all we ever do in those situations, when people bring someone to me in that case, I show them the symptom list, and then I talk to them about how much early intervention helps Jake. Because I firmly believe, if you met my kid today, again, as Father said, unless he was excited or unless he was nervous, you probably would not know that he's on the spectrum. You'd think he's kind of a quirky little kid, but he talks a mile a minute like his mother. He has no problem, he's done spots on the local radio station, he has no fear of anything, I mean, he just exceeds everybody's expectations. Like, I remember saying to my sisters that I don't care if he uses a particular really bad curse word as long as he uses it appropriately, back when he was completely nonverbal, and that comes back to bite me every once in a while now that we're silent. So, but I mean, for us that's always been the best thing we can do, is tell people how much of a difference it's made. When this kid went from completely nonverbal to working at grade level, and he was 2 points shy of honor roll this last quarter, so it's, the early intervention works, and I can't say enough about it. And we are lucky to live in New York. As much as we all pay out the nose in taxes, thank you all, because my kid has gotten a lot as a result of that. And I was once offered a position in South Carolina for Alcoa as a communications director for a plant, and it would have been a huge increase in salary for me. And I had a couple other friends who had gone to that location, and they looked into disability services in the area and just said, Darcy, stay in New York. You would be doing Jacob a disservice to do this. So I thank you all for paying taxes so my kid can have all these outstanding services. Anything else?
So is there a way to get over the cursing thing? Because this little kid has a mouth like, and he's 4.
I'm lucky. Jake will always, he's heard curse words, trust me. So, but if he has something where he wants to use a curse, he will ask for permission first. It is the weirdest thing I've ever seen in my life. The hard thing is, like for Jake, regular punishments mean next to nothing with him other than taking away privileges. Like, I mean, I'm not a big person I would never spank, but it wouldn't matter anyway because it would have no impact on Jacob. He is impervious to pain, completely impervious to pain. And short of losing privileges, nothing really phases Jake. So really the best thing we've always done is reward the good behavior, and that's kind of the concept behind applied behavioral analysis therapy, is you do discrete trials of a particular skill, and you reward them when they do what's expected of them. So you might do 5 repetitions of turn taking while playing a game, and if for everyone they do right, they get a reward. And so, but it's a pretty regimented system of therapy to teach appropriate behaviors. Anything else?
Do you think there is some developmental growth in the child based on autism? I mean, is it the responsibility of the parents? In your case, you're so loving, kind, and you're taking care of the child. Whereas this is in the other family, they don't. Do you see the difference if the body is on board here and the body is on board there?
This is one of the things that I get sad about the most, is if you're familiar with kids with disabilities, they have this lovely thing at school districts called Committee on Special Education. And so you have to go sit in a Committee on Special Education meeting and fight for services for your kid. It's an absolute joy. I hope you can see the sarcasm on my face. So we have had some that have been like screaming match battles, literally. Now I know my child is very expensive to educate. That one-on-one aid he has, in most districts, obviously that's an entry-level position, but you're still talking about a $20,000 a year salary and probably another $20,000 in benefits. So it's something they're always looking to take away. So me, again, I'm well equipped. I'm a mama bear, as you can tell. I'm not shy in any way, shape, or form. And I really love criminal justice and law, so I have no problem reading special education law for fun. Like, I can understand the language really well, and it's something I enjoy, reading the law. So I'm really well equipped when I go into those meetings, and still I feel like an idiot. They bombard you with all these test results, they bombard you with all these scores, they don't tell you what any of it means, and then they try to use it as justification to remove services from your child. So when I walk into these meetings, I usually apologize in advance for my behavior. My husband also apologizes in advance for my behavior. And so I think about, usually when I'm doing my apology for my behavior routine, they'll say, at least you show up and you actively care, because there are a whole bunch of parents who don't even bother showing up. And so I think of how hard I have to fight to get my kid that one-on-one aid, and what about all those people who don't have anyone fighting for them? And so there's this huge disparity in outcomes based on ability levels, and it's really one of the inadequacies that nobody seems to be able to identify how to correct within the system. Because like you said, there's a lot of these kids who have disabilities who come from families where there are other disabilities, or mental health issues, or substance abuse issues, or other things contributing to the fact that they can't actively manage the kid's care. And so it's really, I don't know how to address it, and I know my son is extremely fortunate for the fact that he has, you know, two parents who are really, really evil and really, really well educated. But you know, it's
That's not the case in a lot of cases.
that most.
I think if you develop a good relationship with a school psychologist, having you telling the school psychologist, the one that did the evaluation on whoever, about what's going on in your child's life, I think they will go into the committee and special education meeting on your side.
I will say it depends on the school psychologist.
That's true.
So I've had
That's
both.
very true.
And usually we have one person who's like your go-to, and sometimes it's as simple as these people who are newly hired don't have tenure. And so they don't feel like they can rock the boat. We've had that with Jake's general education teacher a number of times where they outright said to us ahead of time, the speech teacher is going to play point on advocating for Jacob because I don't feel like I can without being ostracized by my district. You know, so it's, and then again, that just stacks the deck that much more in favor of these kids who have someone who can advocate strongly for them. There are services that you can reach out to, like Jake gets a lot of his services through the ARC. He gets some direct support provision and some other services through the ARC. And they have people who will go with you to some of these meetings. But again, the quality sometimes is a dice throw. Jake has been very lucky. We always get really good workers, but because they know I will fire them if they don't, and I will ask for a new one, and I have done it multiple times. And so they're at the point now where we tend to get the cream of the crop. And again, that sounds unfair, and it kind of is unfair, but that's unfortunately the way it's set up.
So we have to be an advocate for your child. Yeah. So who else is going to do it?
And that's it. But you just wish you could advocate for all of them, you know, and I wish I had the time to do that.
Yeah.
And my sister's two kids have two forms of OCD, very different. But with her, they actually got a coordinator who helped with the whole special ed stuff, who had a law firm behind her. And so she could say things, and you know, she wasn't a lawyer, but there was a law firm behind her. And it's amazing how much difference that made to get the services that my nieces needed. And you know, just because there was that rod behind the door that said, you know, you don't do this, then we're gonna call, you know.
And even just knowing the language to use. Like,
Yes.
I don't know how many times I've threatened them with, do we need to adjourn this meeting and call for arbitration? Because they really don't want to do that. They really, really don't want to do that. And so I have no problem to do it. And my other pro tip, if you do know anyone who has to do this committee on special education, the way I have saved Jake from losing his one-on-one aid for the last 5 years that they've been trying to take it away is every single time they say, we think he'll be fine, I say, I need metric data that proves he'll be fine. You do a unit with the aid and a unit without the aid of comparable difficulty level and show me he can perform similarly and I will be fine with it. Until you can demonstrate to me numerically that's the case, you are not touching it.
What grade is your son going in?
He's going into 7th grade.
My experience over the years is they try to wean away from one-on-one aids as they get into high school because of the fact that they're going to be singled out as having a one-on-one aid being, mainstreamed in the regular classes. So I wouldn't be surprised if you're going to run into that.
And it can go
At
either
some
way,
point.
because we have a colleague at the Chancery, one of the gentlemen who runs IT, and he has an adult son with autism who has a very similar functioning level as Jake. And his advice has consistently been, do not give up the one-on-one aid because that is also the buffer from bullies. You know, so yes, there is some, you know, it might exclude them a little bit, but it also protects them in some cases. Jake is in Brushton-Malira School District. It graduates 55 kids typically, so he has not had the issues yet. But I also recognize that we are getting to the age where kids get mean. And so if we are going to have a problem, it's probably going to be in these next 2 years.
Good luck.
We'll all keep you in our prayers.
I can use them all, trust me. Anything else? Again, thank you all for giving me this opportunity. Thank you for listening to all this, and please, please, please be welcoming parish communities.
I know that many parishes find it challenging to be welcoming, period, to people who have no special challenges. So it's that much more important that we take what we heard today and go back and figure out how we can make a difference in our parishes. Come up with some specific ideas that you're willing to do yourself. Don't just go to Father and say, Father, I think we should do this, because Father's already got enough on his plate. But if we each go back to our parish and say, I'd like to do this, would it be all right with you? Chances are Father's going to say, great, I love that idea. So let's not let it drop today. Let's go back to our parishes and make a difference in some small way.